Well, I want to welcome all of you who are joining in at Northgate and at Madras and those joining online. We are glad to have you be a part of what we're going to do today. We're learning these days from a man named Moses about his life of following God and how we can follow God as well. And I want to talk to you about something today that is often misunderstood in the life of following God, but is a part of every life of following God. It's something that we don't talk about a lot, but we probably should. I want to talk to you about following God in His roundabout ways. Following God when the way that He leads you doesn't seem to make sense. I want to talk to you about what happens when God leads us in a way that we did not want to go, about saying yes to God and staying faithful then. And to get at that, I need to take you on a little bit of a review of where we've been. This would be a chance for those of you who haven't been a part of the series to catch up with where we are a little bit, but say to you that all of the messages in this series are online for free. You can go back and watch them and catch up on this. But let me start back with where Moses, this man that we're learning about, gets his initial call from God to be the person to lead the people of God out of the land of Egypt. Here's what God says to Moses and what He tells him is going to happen in Exodus chapter 3, verse 7. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So you get the basic story of what's going to happen in this book called Exodus. God's going to take His people, He's going to take them out of a bad place of slavery and oppression, and He's going to take them to a good place, a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of God's blessing. And it sounds real simple. Really, it just has two parts. God's going to come and He's going to take them out, and He's going to lead them to a good place. Now, that really shouldn't take all that long. In fact, if we had time and I could show you on the map, really the whole journey of this thing is only like 250 miles. All they have to do to get from Egypt to the Promised Land is cross the Sinai Peninsula. It really is only about 250 miles. It's about the same distance of leaving Coweta County and driving to Panama City, which a bunch of you will be doing this week of the 4th of July, or a bunch of you are now watching online because you did it this week. But it's not a long journey at all. It's just about that distance, Coweta County to Panama City, Florida. Even walking, they could have walked it in a matter of weeks or months at the most. But they don't take the direct route. Instead, something really surprising happens. God leads them in a way that they didn't expect to go, a way that no one would want to go. God leads them in a totally different way. In fact, let me read it to you in Exodus chapter 13. When Pharaoh let the people go, Pharaoh's the king of Egypt, he had them in slavery. God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, that'd be the Sinai Peninsula, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led His people around by the roundabout way of the desert toward the Red Sea. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. God takes His people on this roundabout way. It's not the way they expected. It's not the most direct route. It's not the way that anyone would choose to go. It's a roundabout way. Now, imagine what this looks like. They're gathered. For 400 years they've been praying that God would come and He would rescue them from slavery. And Pharaoh has finally relented. God's mighty hand has led them out. And now they're going to be delivered. He said they can go. They're standing ready to go, and they've been told that they'll have a cloud to lead them by day. And they know how far it is. It's not going to be that long until they'll be in total God's blessing. But when the pillar begins to move, it doesn't go the way they'd expected. They had expected that it would go a little bit west and then north, and they'd be in the Promised Land. But instead, the pillar moves south. They've been given a directionally challenged pillar. God takes them in a way they don't expect. He's leading them to the Promised Land, but He's taking them on the roundabout way. He's taking them in the last place in the world that anybody would want to go. He's leading them directly into the desert. Well, that leads to a crisis. Will God's people follow Him when following God doesn't go the way they think it ought to go? Will they follow God and obey Him when following God doesn't seem to make the most logical sense? Will they be faithful on God's roundabout way? One of the qualities of God that is most irritating to me and to lots of impatient people is that God never seems to move in a hurry, and He leads in roundabout ways. He takes us to the promised land through the desert. And the roundabout way is not the best way. It's not like a minor detour. It's not the shortest way by far. In fact, do any of you who have studied this story before, do you know how long it finally takes them to get to where they enter the promised land? Just yell it out if you know it. Yeah, I heard somebody at Northgate say it. It's 40 years. 40 years it takes them on a journey that should have taken them a matter of weeks. They take them into the desert. Now, I should note that spending time in the desert with God is something that God often does with people. In fact, some of God's very best people spend time in the desert. Moses, you might remember in the beginning of this story, Moses kills a man in Egypt, and he has to run away from Pharaoh, and he runs into the desert, and he stays there until God calls him to come back. Elijah is a prophet of God, and he gets very depressed after he's done what God tells him to do, and he goes into the desert, and in the desert, when he's far away from everything else, Elijah finds God. Jesus, just soon after Jesus had heard the voice at his baptism say, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," we're told that the Holy Spirit leads Jesus into the desert. And in the desert, he begins his journey with God. Everybody, it appears, at some point in following God, almost everybody spends time in the desert. The desert's a place that you don't want to go. The desert's a place that you never dreamed about. It does not flow with milk and honey. It's not what you thought following God would be like. It's not about God's blessing. At some point or another, if you're a follower of Christ, you pretty much can be clear that you're going to spend some time in the desert. And in the desert, you're going to learn about the roundabout ways of God. Now, I know that me saying that God's going to lead you into the desert the way you don't want to go, that's not the kind of thing that makes for a good book that would be a Christian bestseller like Your Best Life Now and How to Have God's Blessing in 10 Simple Steps. But I'm telling you, it's the truth that almost everyone who follows God is going to learn about following God in this roundabout way. I'm just telling you that when your heart aches with hurt or loss, times when you're tired and sleep doesn't refresh you, times when you want something and the best you can tell it's a good thing, it's not even a selfish thing, it's a thing that you know that God would want, but God does not answer your prayer. Sometimes you're in the desert, and the desert is because of a circumstance that's happened. A relationship ends, and your heart breaks, and you go into the desert. You have a child that you've tried as hard as you can to keep on track, but the child goes off the rail. You have a financial disaster, and you can't figure how to handle it on your own, and you wind up in the desert. You have a dream, and you work, and you pray, and you live for that dream day after day, year after year, and one day it finally comes to you that the dream has not come true, and it dies. And a little bit of you dies with the dream that day. But sometimes you're in the desert, and it's nothing that you can tell that you did for no discernible reason of all. You wind up in the desert. Then, faith is impossible. You pray and you worship, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to pray and worship when it seems like God doesn't hear, that God's led you to this place and you're all alone. Some of you right now, you're right now in the desert. And I wish I had the words that I knew I could make you hear to say to you, God has not forgotten you. God sees you. God knows that you're there. God is with you. If you will remain faithful in the desert, God will lead you. God has not left you. Some of you have been there. Some of you are right now. God's not forgotten you. He's walking with you in the desert. And here's the deal. God is at work on the roundabout way. God is at work in the desert. In the ways that you see, in ways that you don't see, in ways that you often won't understand. God's way is rarely the quickest way. It's rarely the simplest way, but it's the best way. God builds people strong in the desert. So in the time that I have left today, I want to talk to you about lessons that come from living with God on the roundabout way in the desert. And if you're there right now, I hope you'll hear and you'll see what God is and can do in the desert. And if you're not there right now, I hope you will learn, because now is the time to learn, because everybody who follows God spends some time with God on a roundabout way. The first lesson I'd want you to see is that the desert is the place where we learn to live with a God who is patient, where we follow a God who is not in a hurry. The desert is a place where we learn to trust God moment by moment, one day at a time. The people on this journey with Moses are just like us, and when they're in the desert, they want to get out of the desert. And the temptation, of course, when you're in that place is to look for some kind of quick fix, which, of course, for them would mean that they go back to slavery in Egypt. Every day they wake up. Every day there's a pillar of fire. And every day the pillar of fire takes them away that they don't want to go. And every day they have to make the decision, will I follow again today when I don't understand? Even more difficult, I think, is the days that they would wake up and the pillar of fire would not move at all, which some days it didn't. And they'd have to say to themselves, will I sit and wait for God to move when I know the way that He promised we were going? I could get to the promised land on my own. It would just take me leaving God behind. Will they be patient in the roundabout way of God? This is a lesson that God teaches over and over. Last week, as Jason taught, he taught us about how God provides for them on their way with manna. And God told them that they should only take enough manna to be fed for that day. But the Bible says that some of them, they couldn't trust that much. And they got patient, and they started to want to stockpile it. Moses told them in Exodus 16:19, let no one leave any of it, the manna, over until the next morning. Just enough for today. No leftovers. One day at a time. But they got concerned, like I probably would have got concerned, honestly. What if God doesn't supply anymore? What if there isn't anymore? How will I feed my kids? How will I take care of my family? And in 16:20, we're told that maggots began to grow if you tried to keep it overnight, that manna bred worms, and if you tried to keep it longer than a day. Manna was very good, but it had a very short shelf life. So you had to learn that God was going to feed you day by day by day. When morning would come, God would feed His people again, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And while His people were in the desert, somewhere around 300 or 500 or 1,000 days in a row of God providing manna, what God is hoping is that eventually they'll say to themselves, I believe because God has done it in the past, God will provide for me again tomorrow. You'll learn the lesson of patience when you spend time with God in the desert. For some of you, marriage has become a desert. You had hopes and dreams of what your marriage could be, but now, to be honest, it's none of that. Will you remain faithful in a marriage that's like a desert? Will you be faithful to God in spite of the fact that this isn't what you hoped for? Will you stay truthful to what you said you would do, like we saw in the video, in spite of how hard it becomes? One of my all-time favorite stories is of an old couple that have been married 40, 50 years, and they're laying in bed at night, and the woman is tossing and turning, and finally she says out loud to her husband, when we were first married, you used to hold my hand when we would come to bed. Well, the husband really doesn't want to because he has arthritis in his fingers, but he slowly reaches over and he holds her hand. But she's not satisfied. She says to him, when we were young and we were first married, you used to snuggle up next to me in bed. Well, slowly he rolls over and he puts his arm around her and he snuggles up next to her. But she's still not satisfied. She says, when we were young, you would nibble on my ear when we were in bed. Well, suddenly he throws the covers off and he gets out of bed. She says, where are you going? He says, I'm going to have to go get my teeth. It's one thing to nibble on an ear when you're young and perfume is in the air and nibbling is easy. It's another thing to nibble an ear when the sin of Bengay is in the air, and you're going to have to go get your teeth. The question is, will you learn to be patient when you spend time in the desert? Will you obey God one day at a time, one moment at a time, with a God who's not in a hurry? Will you persist and pray when it sounds like your prayers aren't being answered? Will you be obedient in the desert when you'd rather not obey? I bet everybody joining in has a relationship that's a little bit like a desert. Will you be patient with the desert, the life-sucking people in your life? Will you be patient with them? Will you commit and say, I will be patient with them, and then here's the hard part. Just as God is patient with me, I will learn patience in the desert. The desert is where you learn patience, when you walk with God on the roundabout ways, with a God who is not in a hurry. Will you learn patience? The second lesson is hard. It's that the desert is a place where, if you'll allow Him to, God will make you real strong. In the desert, God's at work building people. The question that we always ask when we're in the desert is why? Why do I have to go through this? Why is it taking so long? Why doesn't this get better? Now, the great thing about this particular account is because we're looking at it years after it takes place, we hear what was on God's mind. Exodus 13:17, which I read a minute ago, says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, the direct route, though that was shorter. Why? For God thought, if the people face war, they will change their minds and go back to Egypt. Now, of course, God was perfectly capable of leading them in war, and we're going to see that in days ahead. He was perfectly capable of delivering them against the Philistines, and we'll see that. But they weren't aware of it. They were not confident of it. God knows that they don't have faith, and they might turn back. So God takes them on the roundabout way so they can grow strong. Here's the point. God is not near as concerned with where His people are, where they're going, but who they're becoming. God's not near as concerned where I am in my life, not near as concerned about where the job that I have or where I live or how much money I make as God is with who I'm becoming. And it's really easy to trust God when everything's going right. It's easy to trust God when your prayers are getting answered and all the charts are up and to the right, when your kids are growing and their teeth are straight, when your boss likes you and mama's happy. Faith is easy when life is easy. But in the desert, well, that's a whole nother story. In the desert, when you've lost your job and you don't have another one lined up, but you still trust that God sees you and provides for you, you'll grow real strong. In the desert, when you have a child that you've loved as best as you can, not perfectly, no parent loves their child perfectly, but when you've done the best you can and your child is still off track, and you trust that God sees and loves your child. In the desert, when you remember that God Himself has children and they're off track, and God sees and hears and God knows the pain that you're in. When you've been betrayed and you feel alone and you see that everything is as bad as it can be, will you still trust God then? In the desert, when you don't know why, when you can't see what God is up to, then your faith gets strong. It's when you're being led in a way that you would never want to go, in a place that you'd never want to go, to do things that you never thought that you would have to go through. When you have to trust God, will you trust God then? Will you be able to say, God has been faithful to me in the past and never let me go, and I will not go back to the way that I used to be? It's when you're on the roundabout way that you say, no matter what, I will not go back to living apart from God. Even if I spend the rest of my time in the desert, I'm going to follow Jesus. Then you are growing strong in soul. On the roundabout way, that's where we learn that we can really trust God. Some of us right now, we find ourselves on the roundabout way. Don't think that God's forgotten you. Don't think that God doesn't see. Don't think that He doesn't know. He cares. Some of you have been looking for a relationship. You want a spouse, and you've been looking for a long time, and it doesn't seem to come. You've been looking for Mr. and Mrs. Right, and you're at a point of just settling for Mr. and Mrs. Not so terribly wrong. Will you trust that God will take care of you and that God sees you? Will you remain sexually pure even though everything pushes you to move outside the bounds of that? Will you be faithful to what God asks you to do and trust that He can take care of your needs? Some of you are in a place, in a roundabout way, in your financial life, and there are quick, easy ways you think that you can get out of it, but they're not the way that God designs. Will you trust that God sees and God knows and God will provide for you day by day? Some of you are in a place in your life where you're in recovery, and every day, day by day, you have to decide, will I trust God again? Will I give my life, my will, my control over to God again, or will I go back out? Will you trust God and grow strong? Will you say, even though I'm in the midst of this particular desert, I'm not going to give in, I'm not going to go back, I will continue to follow Christ, even if I have to follow Him forever in the desert? I don't know what your desert is, but can you say that you will not give up and you will continue to follow? And when you do, God is making you very strong. In the desert, you learn about patience. In the desert, you learn that you can really trust God. And then finally, it's in the desert that you come face to face. I come face to face with my temptation and my sin. In the desert, we come face to face with the power of darkness. This is true even in Jesus' life. Jesus is led in the desert, and Satan tempts him. But here's something we don't talk about, and I don't really know why, but maybe we should. It's that we need the desert to bring us face to face. It's in the desert sometimes, only in the desert, that we can see who we really are and what's true about our heart. And I'm not saying that every time you're in a desert it's because there's some deep, dark secret in your life. My gosh, the world clearly shows that that's not true. There are plenty of people that are way off track with God, but their life always seems to be blessing after blessing after blessing. Life is not that simple or clean. But what I'm saying is that often in the desert is the place where I come face to face with me and the darkness that is true in me. In the desert, I have the chance to see myself like I can at any other time and find how much I need God. One of my favorite authors died not too long ago. His name was Brennan Manning, and Brennan was a Catholic priest. For his whole life long, he struggled with alcohol. And in one of Brendan's early books, he writes about a man named Max, who was a very wealthy man. And Max had been very successful, but Max was a raging alcoholic. And he would never come face to face with his alcoholism or what it was doing to him or to his family. But Max finds himself at one point, when Brennan writes about it, he's in a rehab center with Brennan. And they're under the care of a very skilled therapist named Sean Murphy O'Connor. I want to tell you about one of their sessions. In one group session, O'Connor was focusing on Max, and he knew that if Max had any hope at all, that Max's defenses had to come down, and so he's pushing Max really hard. So he asked Max, how long have you been drinking like a pig? And Max said, I think that's unfair. But O'Connor won't let him go, and under constant cross-examination as the group sits and listens, finally Max admitted that he did always keep more than 2 cases of vodka in his garage at all the time, with a case of gin, bourbon, and scotch, a bottle of vodka on his nightstand, a bottle of gin that he carried in his suitcase for traveling, and 3 bottles of gin in the office just for making it through the day. After first having lied about it, he finally said, well, I guess we all gild the lily every once in a while. And somebody in the group muttered lowly, you're a liar. Max says, now, come on. There's no need for anybody to get vindictive about this thing. O'Connor then asked, Max, have you ever been unkind to one of your kids? Max suddenly begins rattling off how wonderful he's been to his family and how he's always provided, not like other people do, but that he's always done so well by his kids. And O'Connor breaks right in and says, Max, that's not what I'm asking. I think every father would say at some time he's done something unkind to one of his kids. I'm saying, have you done that? And if so, could you give us an example of that? Max says, well, I was a little unkind to my 9-year-old daughter this past Christmas Eve. O'Connor says, well, what happened? Max says, I can't remember. O'Connor says, well, where did it happen? Max says, I already told you, I can't remember. But I have a bad feeling about what happened on that Christmas Eve. While the rest of the group tried to push and probe, O'Connor had already planned that he would call Max's wife in the middle of the group session. So he called her, he dialed her, he put her on the speakerphone in the middle of the room. He said, Mrs. O'Connor, this is Sean Murphy. This is Sean Murphy O'Connor. Are you Max's wife? And she said, yes. We're in the middle of a group session with Max, and he's telling us that on Christmas Eve he was a little unkind to one of his children, his 9-year-old daughter. Could you fill us in on the details? He can't seem to remember. After a pause, a soft voice filled the room. Yes, our daughter Debbie wanted a special pair of shoes for her Christmas present, and her dad said that he would get them for her. So Max and Debbie drove downtown. He took her to the store that she wanted to go to, and he told her that she could have any pair of shoes, the best pair of shoes that she wanted, and that's exactly what she went and bought. She got the shoes that she wanted, and when they took them back outside and got in Max's truck, she leaned over and said, "You're the best dad in the whole world." Well, Max decided that he would celebrate, and on the way home, he stopped by a tavern. It was a few miles from home. He told Debbie he would only be a few minutes, so it was very cold outside, about 12 degrees above zero, so he left the motor running. He locked both of the doors so nobody could get in and hurt Debbie, and he said, "I'll be right back out." There's a long pause, and they could tell that she was crying. And then she said, Max met some of his old buddies in the tavern, and he lost track of time, and he didn't come back out until past midnight, and he was very drunk. The truck had run out of gas some hours before, and the truck windows were frozen shut. Debbie was badly frostbitten, and we had to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, the doctor saw that she'd been frostbitten. They cut off her thumb and 2 of her toes, and she'll be deaf in both ears for the rest of her life. When she finished speaking, Max was weeping on the floor. Brennan goes on to talk a little bit more about the darkness that exists in the heart of every human being, and how hard we try not to see it, and how much need we have to come to grips with the truth about us. Now, maybe you hear that story, and the truth is, for most of us joining in, we haven't done something that dramatic. We haven't done something that dark. But I've wounded people that I committed to love in ways that are dark enough that I would not want to say to you in this public kind of way. And although we avoid it so much and we don't want to talk about it, the truth about you and I is that at some point we have to come to grips with the darkness that exists inside of us, that's in our life. And I don't know how to say this any other way than just to say it to you. Some of you are living in bitterness, and you can't see it, but it's leaking out on you and everyone around you. It's ruining the relationships to you. And even though you have been offered forgiveness and grace by God, you will not offer it to anyone else. Or you're living with envy, and you will not stop. There's resentment building up inside of you, and it claws its way out of you little by little, and it affects people around you. There's a judgmental spirit about you that's just deadly to every relationship you have. God is calling you. And God is leading you in His love and grace for the purpose of healing that. And if necessary, I believe God will lead you on a roundabout way into a desert place so that you will come face to face with the awfulness of your own sin and say, God, I want to be free of this more than I want anything else in my life. Today, as you listen to this, you could say, God, I confess my sin. I want to see the darkness in me. Would you make it clear to me, and would you lead me to be open to how I can change? The desert is where that happens. The desert is where I come face to face with me, where I learn patience, where I grow strong, and where I see who I really am. Earlier in the service, we told you about the connection card. Would you go ahead and get that right now? It should be on a chair nearby you. Maybe you sat on it like I do sometimes, but would you get it right now? We say this to you every week, that this is an individual card, and the reason is because we believe every individual is here, not by accident, but God has a purpose for you being here. And I believe that today some of you know that you were here to hear this, to be a part of this, because you've spent time in the desert. Maybe the day is the day that you begin to take steps of following God, even in the desert. As you fill this out, on the back of it, you'll see that there are next steps, and some that we've suggested. Maybe today that you want to just begin to pray that God will teach you patience as you learn from Him in the desert places in your life. Or maybe that you'd be brave enough to say, God, would you reveal to me the dark places in my life so that I could begin to change? Or maybe the step for you is that you want to begin a relationship, that you want to move into connection. Maybe you want to begin to follow Jesus no matter what, not because of what you can get out of it, because in the desert you can learn that you can lose everything, but you can find God. And you can learn that God is enough. Maybe today that's the relationship that you want to begin. God is in the desert. He's leading every day. He's leading every night. He's the God of the roundabout way. He's the God that goes to the throne of the world where every knee bows and every tongue confesses. But He does not go about it on the straight path. He goes to that throne by way of a cross where He gives His life for us. He says, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. I will be with you. You stay faithful to me. For those of you who are in the desert, or you will be there tomorrow or the next day, stay faithful in the roundabout way of God. Because the day is coming when the Bible says every mountain will be made low and every valley will be raised up. And it says in that day when Jesus returns and He welcomes all of us, that even the desert will bloom. And those who remain faithful will see it. I hope you will. If you'll bow, I'll pray for you. And now, Father, I pray for those that are joining in today. I pray that you will help us to see where you're leading in the roundabout way. And even if we don't see, that we will commit to be faithful to you, that we'll continue to follow even when we're in the desert. God, thank you for your guidance. Thank you for the trust that we have that you'll never leave us, that you'll never forsake us. Help us as we take the next steps that you lead us to follow you. In Jesus' name, amen. Now as we receive the offering and we turn in our connection and next step cards, we're going to listen to this song. I want you to listen to it and read these words as we receive the offering together.